Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with another episode, and just in case if you don't know, I'm Siam, and I'm the Outreach Communications Officer at Trinity Hall, one of the colleges of Cambridge, and I'm here with Marcus.
And I'm Marcus Tomlin. I'm the Director of Admissions here at Trinity Hall.
Nice. So we're recording this in mid-October. It's in the middle of this year's admissions round. Everyone would have just submitted their personal statements, put in their UCAS applications. It's quite a busy time. So today we're going to be talking about one of the parts of the admissions process for some or several of the subjects for Cambridge. We're going to be talking about the written work. So Marcus, for anyone who doesn't know, can you explain to us what is written work in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not the case that people have to submit written work for all the subjects that we offer. It's a subset of them. It tends to be subjects on the arts and humanities side and also some of the social sciences. But really for those courses that require it, we're simply looking for written work that's been produced usually as part of the school syllabus that someone's been following, so as part of their A-levels or their IB exams or whatever qualifications they're taking. And these are things we can talk about in a bit more detail maybe during the podcast, but basically, often essays, but not always essays, that they've written as part of their schoolwork. Ideally, essays that have been marked by one of their teachers, and we ask them to submit it to us so that we can read it carefully and assess it, and it just forms part of the picture that we get of their ability and the potential they have to develop further if we offer them a place here at Cambridge. So that's kind of the role it plays. But again, that's just a high-level summary.
And I believe written work is one of those things where whether your subject, the subject you've applied for, requires you to submit written work, really does depend on the college that you've applied for.
Yeah, there is a bit of variation between the colleges, which we all appreciate is a bit annoying when people are thinking of applying. So there are some subjects where the vast majority of colleges will ask for written work. And there are other subjects where it's a smaller subset of the colleges that do. But again, once someone's decided which course they're going to apply for, and if they've decided to apply to a particular college, then they just need to check on the web pages for that college, and it will be absolutely clear whether they need to submit written work or not.
Nice. So I'm just going to list out the subjects that require written work from Trinity Hall, but just bearing in mind that this is for this year's application year, so it might change next year and it might not be necessarily the same for other colleges, but just to kind of give a feel for one of the colleges at Cambridge, which subjects they require written work. I think it's quite interesting to hear the list of subjects. So we have Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic studies, archaeology, the architecture, which requires a portfolio, which we'll talk more in detail about. Ancient and Middle Eastern studies, if it's with a European language. Classics, English, history and modern languages, history and politics, human and social science. So
HSPS.
Yeah, HSPS. Well, human and social political sciences. As you can see, I've never had to expand on what HSPS stands for. Human, social, political sciences, known as HSPS. Land economy, modern and medieval languages, or MML. Music and theology. So quite a vast range of subjects. I guess at least for me, when I've ever thought about written work, I've always assumed it was probably just something for the humanities subjects, but it's interesting to hear that so at least for Trinity Hall, subjects like land economy, HSPS, music especially, require written work. So one question that we get quite a lot is can a student write like a new essay as their written work and to get it marked by a teacher that's like specifically for the written work, I guess, because some students are wanting to know that if they're applying for a subject like land economy, where they feel like they don't have an essay that's specifically geared towards land economy, because they're not taking land economy at A level.
Yeah, I think that those sort of cases are slightly different. So if someone is applying for a course like land economy, well, no one takes an A level in land economy. It doesn't exist. No one takes land economy as one of their IB options because it doesn't exist. They'll probably be doing things like economics and maybe geography and maybe law, things like that. So probably the majority of people who submit written work will just submit essays that they've written as part of the courses that they're studying at school. But some may well choose to write a new essay that's specifically focused on a topic they know they'll be studying as part of the land economy course here. That's fine. But we don't really want people to go to the trouble of writing a new essay or two new essays unless they really feel they need to. That's why the expectation is it will just be work that's produced as part of their studies at school, because we don't really want to add to the kind of burden of what they need to complete as part of the application process for Cambridge.
Nice, yeah, because I guess it would be a lot of extra work to write. Like if you need two pieces of work,
yeah, it can be,
especially during a busy year 13 year.
Yep.
It's the personal statement and the My Cambridge application is already quite a lot
Yep.
to do.
Yeah.
There's also another question of the students who are applying post A level, or potentially mature students who are over 21, where they feel like their essay ability, writing ability has advanced a lot more compared to their essays that they would have written at school. Are they able to submit a more recent, newer essay?
Yeah, they can do. And again, for people who apply in that situation, they've already completed their school exams and they're applying post-qualification. It can make more sense for them to write something that's more reflective of what they're capable of at the moment, rather than submitting essays they wrote maybe a year or 2 years ago. That it makes sense for them to write something that's new. Again, if they can get someone, maybe a former teacher, to have a look at it and to sort of mark it, that's great. But it's not always possible. Sometimes when people have completed their time at school, they don't really stay in touch particularly with their school, so it's not always possible for them to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question is, so I think everyone knows that certain subjects from certain colleges requires written work, and there's a lot of material online of the procedure and how to make sure you submit your written work perfectly. But I think I'm including this as well, and everyone's in the dark of what is actually being assessed when academics or the Cambridge directors of admissions are what they're looking for when they're going through written work. So I want to hear from you, like what kind of things are being assessed when we're looking at different applicants' written work.
Yeah, I mean, it basically gives us an insight into the type of academic work a particular applicant produces. In that kind of situation, when they've been asked to write an essay on a particular topic, for instance, we obviously have parts of our process, things like the interviews that involve talking to applicants and finding out more about their interests and working through, problems with them, maybe on the science side, or discussing things that they've read on the arts and humanities side. And all of that is really useful and helpful. But ultimately, when the students come here and start studying here, the primary form of assessment is based on written exercises, whether that's essays they write each week for their supervisions, the small group teaching that they have, and then ultimately when they take the exams, the vast majority of that will involve written work. So the written work that we ask them to submit as part of the process just gives us an early initial insight in their ability to sort of, function in that way. So if we take, I guess an example of a subject where it's very common for written work to be requested by the colleges, something like, say, English literature. It doesn't matter which particular texts the applicant has written about. We don't expect the essays to be about Jane Austen or Shakespeare or whatever. Whatever they feel, represents their ability best, they should submit, let's say 2 essays on those topics. And we're just interested to read it through. We're looking for how they're analysing the text that they've chosen to analyse, which particular details they've chosen to focus on, whether there are little nuances of language, whether there are shifts of tone in the text that they're reading that are important, if they're reading poetry, whether they've analysed some of the poetical structures in some detail. So, we're looking for things like that, but we're also looking for a good structure to the essay. Usually essays are written in response to particular questions, and we're looking to see whether the response really does address the question that prompted that response. And if you think about how an essay is constructed, it's often a sequence of paragraphs. I tend to think if for any essay, if you can take 2 paragraphs that are removed from each other and swap them round, if you just cut and paste them and swap them round so that they were in each other's place, and if that really had very little impact on the essay, if that didn't disrupt the flow and structure of it, then it's probably a relatively weak essay. Because usually I think the way an argument develops, it sort of grows organically, and something that's said earlier provides a platform for discussing something that's said subsequently. So I tend to think if you take 2 paragraphs and swap them round, it should really disrupt the essay. It should make it much harder to follow. So we're looking for sort of structural things like that, just to see how the argument is being presented and developed.
Is there a chance in that specific example that those 2 paragraphs should just be 1 paragraph, maybe? Yeah,
it depends. It would depend on the context. But sometimes things are split into sort of 2 sections that could perhaps most usefully be combined into one. And obviously there are lots of different ways to write well about a particular text or a particular topic. So we're not just expecting one specific way of writing, but we'll assess in its own terms the kind of approach that a particular applicant has adopted, and hopefully it will be really impressive and really informative and enjoyable to read.
I think that is a really good, easy piece of advice, and quite original, at least I've never heard of, to encourage people to just to restructure the essay and just see if it still follows, because it's rare. Maybe if you've handwritten it, that might be quite
it's harder.
It might be a bit of an issue, but most people aren't doing that. So that is a really good point. I think also this is really jogging my memory back to when I was studying and working towards grades. But I do remember, I think if you're listening to this and you're struggling with wanting to know what academics are going to be assessing what they're going to be looking for, reading your specification, and especially the top band criteria would be a really good place to look at. I remember when I was applying, I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge, but a speaker had come to our college to give a talk, an admissions talk, and one of the things they said, your teachers would normally discourage you to look at other specifications to the exam that you're taking, which is true in order to do well in the exams, but in order to have a fuller understanding and be able to see different perspectives of approaching the same goal, we would, if you have the time, encourage you to read other specifications and compare them to your own, and to have a fuller understanding of different paths to engage with the same question or achieve the same goal. And I can imagine, someone, let's say, take English for example, reading different specifications and hearing what other specifications are saying, what the top band is and how to achieve it, that would just understanding what they're expecting from you would increase your understanding and in knowing what to achieve at least.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the way you put it there is right. You know, there are ways of approaching studying a subject, let's say at A level, but it's true for all the other school exam types as well. You know, there are ways of approaching that to try and sort of maximize your chances of doing really well in those exams, and that is indeed what people should do if they're taking those exams. But that doesn't necessarily correspond comprehensively with all the things you could possibly do to learn more about English literature or to learn more about history. You know, any A-level course can only include a relatively small number of texts, and there's lots of other things you can read, and it may only focus on you know, a subset of all possible themes and topics that are addressed in English literature. So the more specifications you look at, the more you'll get a range of different approaches really, or perspectives on a topic like English literature, but the same is true for something like history or any of the other subjects that you mentioned in the list. So having that kind of, I don't know, open-minded, broader approach can be a good way of thinking more deeply about the subject in preparation for studying it at university.
I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of similar. My friend, he was studying a humanities degree, and when he was preparing for his finals exams, which effectively he's going to have to write essays in an exam, produce written work for then to be marked. He did do a lot of practice papers, but he read a lot of examiners' reports, and he really believed in. If he was to read on previous examiners' opinions and feedback on what the cohort had done in answering a question and just understanding different ways of approaching a question and what the advice is, then by the time that he's writing his essay, he's learned not only all the advice of what he should do, but also like all the pitfalls.
Things to avoid.
Things to avoid.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, examiners' reports, I think, because they do exist for A-level as well, is something that's not really spoken about, but is a really good resource. And especially for something like, if you're sitting there, you've got to hand in this written work and you don't really know what's going to be assessed, reading at least examiners' reports for your A-level would provide some guidance of things that examiners are looking at when they're...
Exactly. And it often comes down to things like in your written work, you know, how you've sort of defined your terms. You know, if you're writing about a particular topic, especially if it's a complex topic, have you made it clear how you're interpreting that? And have you been sufficiently precise about what it is, you know, you're going to focus on? But then, also thinking about the kind of assumptions you're making. Often, you know, because any written work, there's often a clock ticking. You know, it's often written in time conditions, and so you know, you can't write for an infinite period of time, and so you often end up having to make simplifying assumptions. But you do have a bit of flexibility around which assumptions you make, and at least be aware that you're making them, and maybe state them explicitly somewhere towards the start of the written work, so that the people reading it are aware that you know those assumptions are being made. So things like that can often indicate a real sort of awareness of the complexities around the topic that's being discussed.
I guess because maybe this is a naive question from me, but a pitfall could be in an individual assuming that the examiner knows that you know that these are the assumptions you've made. But so I can imagine someone feeling like this goes without saying that I'm having to explicitly say these are the assumptions I'm making, but it doesn't go without saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's important that the people reading the work are clear about, the approach you've adopted. So the more you can clarify that in the written work at some point, it doesn't have to be in the introduction, it could be at later stages. There's lots of different ways of structuring written work really well. But I think just making it clear the approach you're adopting, being clear about the terms you're using, if there are difficult and complex ideas. I mean, since we've been talking about English literature a bit, if you're writing about texts from the Romantic period, so you're talking about Romanticism. Romanticism has been defined and redefined countless times over a few centuries now. What do you understand by it for the purposes of your written work? What do you take it to mean? Is it a useful category? Is it a category where the definition is clear? Is it a problematical category that should be challenged and maybe undermined? And perhaps what you're discussing in the written work gives good reason for questioning the usefulness of that category. There are many different strategies, many different approaches, but just making it clear which specific approach you're adopting, that's always really useful in written work.
It's quite interesting, because I think, does this ever occur in that, because I think it requires quite a bit of confidence to come out and say, this is how I'm defining this term that's commonly used. Because I can imagine someone maybe a bit not as confident, not wanting to kind of make it clear that this is how they're specifically using that term. But it sounds like you're saying that people should.
They can, and of course it doesn't have to be entirely something of your own invention.
Okay,
You could say, well, in using this term this way, I'm following what academic X has done in the past, whether it's in relation to an historical period or a literary period or whatever it is. So I'm not saying everything has to come 100% out of your own mind, but being aware of how other people who have written about these complex topics have defined certain key terms. And if you have a preference, for one definition over another for reasons you can briefly explain, that again indicates a level of detail that other people who have produced written work about the same topic maybe won't have included.
I see what you mean. So just being clear of like which context that you're using that, and then I guess if you by even doing that, being clear of how you're using these terms, you're showing that you're aware that they could be used differently in different contexts.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I've got a short list of subjects where the written work is slightly different, at least for Trinity Hall. But I mean, these differences are pretty consistent through most of the colleges, if not all of them. So I just wanted to hear more about how these written works are quite different. So instead of written work, there's a portfolio that should be given in for architecture, and I believe design. We just don't offer design at Trinity Hall, but colleges that do offer design require a portfolio. And can you just explain a bit more what a portfolio is for anyone who doesn't know, and how that's different to written work?
Yeah, exactly. So portfolio is different to written work in that it doesn't usually contain really any written work as such. It's normally just a portfolio of artistic work, so drawings or paintings or designs. It doesn't really matter which particular medium has been used. And the portfolio normally forms a significant part of one of the interviews for architecture.
Okay.
So during one of the interviews, it's very normal for the interviewers to sort of go through the portfolio of work that the applicant has submitted, just discussing it, finding out a bit more about it. So yeah, it counts as written work because I guess it takes some sort of some sort of form where it's assessed and factored into the admissions process, but it doesn't consist of a series of essays or something like that. It is sort of, as I say, artistic work. So that's why that one is a bit different.
Yeah, and it's I guess if you're applying for architectural design, the idea of a portfolio isn't as alien to you, because there's a lot of other institutions where submitting a portfolio is like the done thing.
Exactly.
It's just it's not as common in Cambridge besides these two courses.
Exactly. exactly. So yeah, it's just a distinctive type of submitted work that we expect for those courses.
Yeah. So I'm also thinking of MML, so modern medieval languages, because I think it's normally expected that your written work should be submitted in English, but in modern and medieval languages, that's not entirely the case.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you look at some of the web pages about written work, it will often say, the essays have to be in English, but then usually there's the little exception that says, unless you're applying for a subject that requires a modern language, and if it's a modern language that you've been studying at school, so if you're applying for MML, the Modern Languages course here at Cambridge, and if you're already studying French or Spanish to a high level, to A level or equivalent standard, then it's useful if one of the essays can be written in that language, just so that the people assessing you can see the level of written work you can produce in one of your second languages. That's again a slight difference from the usual restriction that all the written work has to be in English.
God, that must be quite tough, writing an essay in French.
But if you've been studying French and if you really like French, it's an enjoyable thing to do.
Yeah,
so,
that's true. I can just imagine someone being like, "Oh, you've used this tense here and this piece of grammar. Can you explain that to me?"
That could well happen, because for all the written work, not just the architecture portfolio, it's certainly something that could be discussed in the interviews. And for a languages interview, they might ask questions about why you've used a subjunctive here, given this grammatical construction, and that might lead to some sort of discussion about the use of subjunctives in that particular language. That may well happen. And even if it's an error that you've made in the written work, that's not a problem. It's a starting point for a teaching opportunity in one of the interviews. So it's not something you should feel ashamed of. We all make mistakes. Those of us who have English as a first language occasionally make mistakes when we're writing emails in a rush.
Maybe you, not me.
On a daily basis, I do that.
No, I'm absolutely joking. It's a really good point, because the whole point of applying for the course is in order to do the course. No one's expecting flawless finalist essays.
Absolutely.
No one should be worried about making mistakes, given that you're applying to do the degree. And it's a really interesting point that you raised about the interviews, because I think it's talked about more about how your personal statement might come up in interviews, maybe not so much for the science subjects, but it sounds like you're saying that there's a fair chance that your written work might be.
Absolutely. There's no guarantee that it will be discussed in the interviews. Sometimes people read it through and they find it really helpful, and they just don't discuss it in the interviews. But equally, you may well be asked some questions about it. So I think it's safer to go into the interviews expecting to be asked questions about your written work, and if that doesn't happen, that's fine. You shouldn't reach any conclusion about that. It doesn't mean to say that they hated your written work at all. They might have been really impressed by it. But I think if you go in mentally expecting there to be some questions about your written work, then you're prepared if that happens. Whereas if you go in expecting there not to be, you might be disconcerted if that happens.
Yeah, I guess you're right in that, expecting but not feeling like there's definitely going to be questions, because you don't want to be so focused on your whole mind's been focused on what you wrote in your written work, your personal statement, but then not having space for something to be brought up that's got nothing to do with that.
It's just getting that kind of balance right, so that you're sort of in the zone, ready to talk about these things, but not exclusively to talk about those things.
Yeah, you don't want to be in a position where you're in the interview, they bring up the written work, and you think to yourself, I haven't read that for 3 or 4 months.
Exactly.
It's worth a read at least.
Just reminding yourself what you wrote. And you might disagree with it now, and that sometimes happens. People sometimes say, I wouldn't write that now for these reasons, and that's really interesting. Yeah. So you don't have to just defend everything that you wrote, quite a few months ago. But certainly reread it so that you remember what you wrote, because it can sometimes just be I don't know, just a bit awkward really if I
Yeah.
say, oh, I was interested in your written work to see blah, blah, blah. Oh, did I write that? Well, yeah, it's here right in front of me. So yeah, just reread it before the interviews, I would suggest.
Yeah, exactly. Because it just helps. I mean, it just helps everyone for the interview. Because I mean, they need to ask you questions. They want to ask you questions based on this submitted work.
Yeah.
And that can only work. That can only work if you remember.
Exactly.
More or less. And lastly, I wanted to also talk about the written work for music. And you mentioned before that can be quite different to like other subjects.
Absolutely, yeah. So for music, some colleges may well ask for essays about topics in music history or whatever it is you've written about as part of your, let's say you're doing A-level music. But in addition to that, they may also ask for one or two harmony and counterpoint exercises. So it can be something like harmonizing a Bach chorale, something like that, which again, if you're not doing music, probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you. If you are doing music, you probably think, okay, yeah, I've started to do that. I sort of know what you're referring to. So again, it's just slightly unusual in terms of written work because it's not just a sequence of words, it's a sequence of notes, written in musical notation. So again, that's why it's just worth flagging up that even though for music, you may also be asked to submit essays as well, you're highly likely to be asked to submit, as I say, some kind of harmonization or something like that.
Yeah.
And you'll be sent information about exactly what's required by the college that's assessing the application.
Yeah, and I imagine you could you can look into what the college requires on their websites as well.
Yeah.
If you're in that position.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think I've overheard that it's also recommended that when you're submitting written work, you should submit a piece of written work that's already been marked by like a teacher. And I was wondering if you could like add or like what's like the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always possible for people to do that for some of the reasons we've mentioned. If someone's applying post-qualification, then it might not be possible. But whenever it is possible, we really prefer that if the work that's submitted has been sort of marked, and we can sort of see the teacher's, writing on the essay or whatever it is. It's helpful just because it gives us a little bit of extra information about the educational context in which the work has been produced. It's useful for us to see the kind of feedback that students have received from their teachers for the essays or whatever else it is that they've produced. So that's why we do that, and of course it does also mean that it's presumably work that the school has assessed and the school is kind of happy with, because different schools mark things in slightly different ways, but sometimes at the bottom there's a little mark, whether it's out of 20 or 30 or 100 or whatever, and so if we can see that the school thinks, this is a good piece of work from our perspective, and again that's helpful for us, and presumably also helpful for the applicant. If the school is saying that essay you wrote in relation to this topic was really, really strong, you should submit that, then that can be a useful guide for the person applying too.
That's a really good point, because I guess if your teacher's saying, if I was you, I'd recommend submitting this, right. That kind of helps everyone,
right. Right.
Yeah, that is a good position to be in. And I guess like it reminds me of peer review in like the academic world. I mean, if you have two people looking at the same piece of work, that's better than one person.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. And if they both say this is good, you should go with this, then you can always choose not to, but it's probably good to go with it. Yeah,
exactly. And it's a bit it takes some stress off the applicant if a teacher's given the go-ahead.
Yeah.
So people also ask, they want to know with the written work how in the application when we're deciding who to give offers to, how like is the written work looked at as much as the personal statement, or like, and how does it compare to each other in the application process and to other parts of the other pieces of information that we have from the students? So like their predicted grades, GCSE scores, etc.?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. And I'd say, for the subjects that require it, the written work does play quite an important role. I would say in some ways it's more important than the personal statements. We did the podcast recently about personal statements, and we sort of emphasized there that the personal statements are really a useful source of information for us, but we don't mark them, we don't give them a score out of 10 or anything like that. Whereas we do read the written work, and sort of treat it as if it's, a kind of piece of academic work that we're kind of assessing, and we don't treat personal statements like that really. So I would say, it does give us a deeper insight into someone's ability and potential and suitability for the course. Gives us a deeper insight than something like the personal statement. But it is something that we consider alongside all the other things as well. So again, if someone, in addition to submitting written work, has also been required to take an admissions assessment, and maybe that has involved them writing an essay of some kind, like for English, for instance, then we'll look at both those things. We'll look at the written work and we'll look at the essay that they've produced as part of the admissions assessment. So it just gives us another data point. And again, if someone impresses us with both of those things and then impresses us in the interviews, then, they're almost certainly going to get an offer just because they've impressed us across all these really important parts of the process. Whereas if someone submits written work that we feel by comparison isn't as strong, and then the essay they produce for the admissions assessment isn't as strong, and then other things maybe don't look as strong, they're far less likely to receive an offer just because we think we've seen stronger applicants. So it gives us another kind of data point. That makes it sound a bit cold really, but you know what I mean? It's a kind of data point that we can look at when we're trying to find reasons for making offers. We want to be impressed, and we're trying to be impressed by the work that the applicants are producing, and it gives them another opportunity to impress us, basically.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, lastly, I think I guess like Cambridge and Oxford interviews, they're like famous in terms of when it comes to talking about the application process. And I think a lot of people would kind of presume that the interview is one of the most important parts of the application process, if not the most important part. And I just wanted to hear from you in what you think and how the interview performance compares with one's written work.
I think it comes down to how people are assessed when they're students here at Cambridge, and the main form of assessment really is their written work. So every week they'll write essays for supervisions, the kind of small group teaching that they have, and then ultimately they'll take exams, and that will be, in the vast majority of cases, just written exams. So it may be the case that in the interviews someone speaks really convincingly about a range of things, and that's great, that's impressive. But then if the written work is in comparative terms really quite weak, that's when we might become a little bit concerned. I think, well, this is someone who speaks very well about this topic, but they seem to be struggling to express that in written form. Whereas if someone is very impressive in the interviews and talks really well about, their subject, and also writes about it really convincingly, with sort of equal insight and sort of brilliance, then that's just very, very, very reassuring for us. So ultimately when they come to Cambridge, the students here are assessed by what they write, not by what they say. Yeah. There are a few slight exceptions to that. So for something like modern languages, some of the assessment it involves speaking a particular language. So but in the vast majority of cases, the assessment is kind of essay-based for the subjects that we're talking about here on the whole.
And I guess I'm trying to emphasize emphasize for anyone who believes in those myths where the interviews trumps everything else. It's just not true.
It's just not true. It's just not true.
It's, as you've said, it's a piece of information, a data point alongside all of the other aspects. Yep. And I think I also, before we finish, wanted to make clear that we're like the written work itself is also another data point used alongside all of the others, because there are a lot of cases where someone might have some really good written work, like a really good interview, but they may have like missed the offer, and then in that situation there's a chance that they weren't picked up by another college and then didn't, despite having very good written work. And I think these situations shows that all of these different parts of the application process, admissions process, work together.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's why people get so sick of us using the word holistic. Yeah. But I mean, if anyone's got a better word that we could use, maybe put it in the comments, because that's the word that we've sort of settled on, you know. But what it really means, is that we look at all of these things together, and we're never just focusing on the written work and dismissing everything else, or focusing on the interviews and dismissing everything else. We put it all together. We look at it holistically, and that's what informs our decision making. Yeah, and we're hoping to do podcasts on each of the admissions process. So we've done one on personal statements, and in that personal statement podcast, we talked about my Cambridge application. We've just finished one on written work, and we're going to do one on interviews as well, and potentially other parts of the application process. And if you haven't seen, we've also been releasing a presentation by Marcus going through the admissions process, which are much shorter videos than these podcasts, but you get to watch the presentation and just get the bare facts of what you need to know for each of the steps in the application. And I believe that if you were to do like a talk on admissions, that is like the talk that you would give. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, we've just cut it up into little subsections. But yeah, if I was giving a sort of 45-minute talk about the whole admissions process, that's basically what the talk would be. Yeah, and we're going to be releasing more of those episodes, going through that talk as well onto our YouTube channel. So thank you, Marcus. Really interesting talk, especially given that I come from a science background. I think I learn a lot more, and yeah, I'll probably be overthinking now whenever I talk, but it happens. And whether you found us on a YouTube or your podcasting platform, tune into next time, and we'll see you then. That's good. Yeah, it's good. Good. That's good. I think we covered everything.